The day my family decided to destroy me, I was wearing a blue sundress and holding a glass of lemonade. My brother handcuffed me in front of everyone, with his own department-issued cuffs, and announced I was being arrested for fraud. What he didn't know was that he had just committed a federal crime. Because I was no longer the weak sister he knew. I was a United States federal district judge. And every second of that backyard cookout was being recorded. But before we continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. I was 35 when I realized my family never truly loved me. It wasn't a gradual realization, it wasn't something I pieced together through years of therapy or honest conversations with myself. It was the exact moment I felt the cold metal of the handcuffs closing around my wrists, in the backyard of the house where I grew up, while my mom kept serving potato salad as if nothing was happening. It was June 10th. A Saturday with blazing sun and humid heat, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes everything in the Atlanta suburbs feel slightly suffocating. My parents' house was in a quiet residential neighborhood, with a manicured lawn and a porch with wicker furniture. My mom had decorated everything with party bunting for the cookout. It was my dad's 70th birthday, and the whole family was there. My name is Katherine. I've been a federal district judge for 2 years. Before that, I spent a decade as a public defender, fighting for people the system preferred to ignore. I was never the pride of the family, that title always belonged to my older brother, Derek, a police detective for 12 years, uniform-obsessed even in his dreams, treated like a hero at every dinner table conversation. I was the one who had left, the one who thought she was better than everyone else, the one who had abandoned her family for a career. I arrived at the barbecue a little after noon, with a cherry pie I bought at a local bakery and a smile that already took effort. I greeted my dad, hugged my mom, exchanged kisses with second cousins who only show up on these occasions. My sister Megan was there with her husband and 2 kids. My brother Derek was there with his uniform shirt partially unbuttoned, his badge hanging from his belt, a beer in his hand, and that posture of someone who never drops the authority act. I didn't suspect a thing. I should have, looking back, the signs were all there, but I was naive enough to believe it was just another uncomfortable family cookout I'd survive in a few hours. My maternal grandmother had passed away 3 weeks prior. Grandma Beatrice, 82 years old, a small, discreet woman who lived her whole life without making a fuss, but who had accumulated, over decades, a considerable estate. Real estate, investments, a savings account nobody in the family knew the exact size of. She was like that, she kept things to herself. The will was read 10 days before the cookout. And that was when everything started shifting beneath the surface, like water heating up before it boils. My grandmother left me almost everything. $4.2 million, distributed among properties and financial investments, with my name as the sole beneficiary and executor of the estate. She had left a handwritten letter, notarized, explaining her decision. It said she had watched me fight on my own since I was young. That I never asked anyone in the family for help while I juggled 3 jobs to pay for law school. That I was the only one who visited her consistently over the last few years, who called every week, who showed up for birthdays even when no one else did. My parents and siblings were left with small symbolic amounts and some personal items. The rest was mine. I don't need to describe the mood after the reading of the will. Anyone who has ever been through family drama knows exactly what happens. The tense silence. The glares. The hushed conversations that stop the moment you walk into the room. The family group texts that suddenly go quiet. And then the passive-aggressive remarks, soft at first, then sharper. Grandma wasn't in her right mind at the end. She always treated you differently and we never understood why. $4 million for one person makes absolutely no sense. I answered everything calmly. I told them I respected their feelings, that I understood it was difficult, but the decision was legitimate and made with my grandmother in full possession of her faculties. That there was nothing to be legally debated. That was the mistake I made. I should have just disappeared for a while. But I went to the cookout. I was leaning against the porch railing, looking out at the yard, when Derek approached from behind. I didn't hear his footsteps, the sound of the grill and the chatter drowned everything out. I first felt the rough grab on my shoulder, which made me turn, and then the dry, mechanical, unmistakable click of a handcuff closing on my left wrist. Time stopped. He yanked my arm hard behind my back, grabbed my right wrist before I could react, and snapped the second cuff shut. The metal was hot from the sun, but even so, it felt like ice running down my spine. I felt the immediate pressure on my joints, the forced angle of my arms behind my back. Derek spun me around so I was facing the rest of the family out in the yard. Some were watching with an expression that took me a second to identify. It wasn't surprise. It was expectation. They knew this was going to happen. His voice boomed, calculated so everyone would hear. He announced that I was being detained on suspicion of document fraud and embezzlement of an inheritance. He said he had proof that I had manipulated our grandmother in her final months to alter the will in my favor. He said that, as a cop, he had a legal obligation to act. My mom didn't drop the serving spoon. My dad crossed his arms and shook his head with a look of disgust I'd recognized since childhood. Megan looked down at the grass. Her husband, Jason, stood there with his hand on his cup, visibly uncomfortable, but saying nothing. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't try to forcefully thrash my way out. I learned, through years in courtrooms, that panic is what aggressors feed on. That the first thing an experienced attorney does in a hostile room is control their breathing. That you never hand your power over to someone who wants to see you crumble. So I took a deep breath, let the air out slowly, and began assessing the situation with all the clarity I could muster in that moment. My brother had handcuffed me. In my parents' backyard. In front of the entire family. Without a warrant. Without formal notification. Without absolutely any legal basis. And he had committed, in that exact instant, a federal crime. There is a massive difference between knowing the law and feeling the law. I knew every statute, every clause, every relevant case law regarding unlawful restraint, abuse of authority, and kidnapping of a federal official. I had read those texts hundreds of times. I had applied those concepts in rulings I signed. But feeling the metal of the cuffs on your own wrist, feeling the dull ache in your joints as your arms are wrenched backward, that is completely different from anything you learn in a textbook. Derek shoved me lightly toward one of the plastic patio chairs and told me to sit. I took the chair. I needed a second to organize what was happening. I surveyed the yard more closely. The kids, Megan's little nieces and nephews, had been ushered inside the house. A detail that didn't go unnoticed, someone had cared enough to get the kids out of the way before the show started. This was planned. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was an operation. My dad took the floor after a few seconds of heavy silence. He used a tone of someone being very reasonable, very patient, very adult. He said the family had met before the cookout and come to a conclusion. That my grandmother's will was irregular. That everyone knew in her final months she was being influenced by me, that I had used my proximity to her to manipulate her decisions. That Derek, as a police officer, had taken the necessary steps to ensure no money was transferred until the situation was resolved. Resolved. That word. I asked, in the calmest voice I could produce, what exactly needed to be resolved. My mom then placed a sheet of paper on the table, literally. She set it on the side table next to the grill, right beside the plate of burgers, like it was just another barbecue item. It was a handwritten document. No lawyer had drafted it. Anyone with 2 semesters of law school would see that immediately, transferring the entirety of my grandmother's estate to her 3 children in equal parts. With my signature line at the bottom. They wanted me to sign it right there, handcuffed, in front of everyone. I took a few seconds to absorb the sheer scope of what was happening. This wasn't a messy family feud. It wasn't an emotional tantrum by maladjusted adults. It was extortion. It was kidnapping. It was coercion. It was an abuse of authority by a police detective who had used his badge and state-issued cuffs for personal gain, against a member of the federal judiciary. Derek stood right behind me the entire time my parents spoke, arms crossed, projecting the posture of someone in absolute control. He was always like that. He liked to take up space, to use his physical presence, to intimidate with his size and his badge. For years, it worked on me. I was the youngest, the bookworm, the one who stayed quiet while he beat his chest. But I was 35 years old. And I wasn't that person anymore. I looked at Derek and said, slowly and deliberately, that he had just committed an arbitrary restriction of liberty against a member of the federal judiciary in the active exercise of their duties. I cited the specific criminal codes. I told him the minimum sentence was 2 years, potentially up to 8 considering the abuse of authority involving police equipment. I told him the fact that I was his sister didn't mitigate it, it aggravated it, because it proved the crime was premeditated and committed with full knowledge of the victim's identity. My mom scoffed. She said I was always dramatic, that I knew how to use words to make it look like I was the victim of everything, that I'd been like that since I was a little girl. Derek laughed. He said I could cite statutes all I wanted, that this was the family backyard, not a courtroom, and that nobody was going to listen to me. He didn't know I didn't need anyone there to listen to me in that moment. Because on my left wrist, partially hidden by the sleeve of my sundress, was the smartwatch the U.S. Marshals Service had provided as part of the security protocol for federal judges. A discreet, ordinary-looking device, with a function most people would never need to use. I had already pressed the silent emergency button 2 minutes earlier, right after being handcuffed, while pretending to adjust my posture in the chair. The signal had already been sent. The GPS coordinates had already been transmitted. The federal cavalry was on its way. What I needed now was time. And evidence. I looked at Jason, Megan's husband. He was the only one who remained visibly uncomfortable, darting his eyes around like someone looking for an exit. Megan kept avoiding making eye contact with me. The other distant relatives had created that specific distance of people who don't want to get involved but also haven't left, close enough to watch, far enough to claim later they didn't know anything. Derek stepped closer again and pushed the document in front of me. He said it was simple. I sign it, he takes the cuffs off, the family is good, the money is split evenly like it should have been from the start. I asked if he was telling me my physical release was contingent on signing that document. He said it was. I needed him to say that out loud. I needed everyone present to hear it. I needed to build the entire factual scenario, not out of spite, but because every word spoken in that backyard was a piece of evidence. I knew Jason had heard it. I saw the exact moment he realized what was actually happening, not a family argument, not a well-intentioned intervention, but a major felony being committed with premeditation. I saw the color drain from his face. He was my only potential ally in that yard. And I needed him to stay sharp. So I asked to use the bathroom. Derek didn't want to let me go. My mom was the one who intervened, not out of consideration for me, but because, in her words, she didn't want me to do something in the plastic chair and ruin the yard. My family's twisted logic on full display. He hauled me up by the arm with more force than necessary, marched me to the half-bath at the back of the house, and stood outside the door while I went in. I closed the door, turned on the faucet to cover the noise, and carefully pulled the watch away from my wrist using the fingers I could move despite the cuffs. The screen displayed the confirmation I needed to see: signal received, location confirmed, response team dispatched. Estimated time of arrival, between 12 and 18 minutes, depending on traffic. I had between 12 and 18 minutes to keep the situation contained without making Derek nervous enough to escalate the violence. I slipped the watch back into place. Let the water run for a few more seconds. Looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at me had reddened wrists, arms tense from the awkward angle, and an expression I knew well, the same one I'd seen on clients who had just realized their situation was dire but that there was still a way out. An expression that wasn't despair. It was calculation. I walked back out to the yard. Derek shoved me back into the chair. My dad was pacing now, gesturing as he talked, building the family's moral case like he was in a courtroom where he was the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury all at once. He said my grandmother had been duped. That I always knew how to use the right words to manipulate people. That it was what I did in my career, convince people of things that weren't true. The irony would have been comical if I wasn't in handcuffs. My mom went into the kitchen to grab more beer, as if this were halftime at a football game. Megan sat on a wooden bench, staring at her phone. Jason stood near the side gate, drink in hand, with the look of someone rapidly calculating the implications of being in that place at that moment. I made a deliberate choice. I started talking. Not loudly, not to provoke. I spoke in a normal, conversational volume, to no one in particular, like someone thinking out loud. I started describing what was happening in precise legal terms, without jargon, without theatrics. I stated that I was currently handcuffed in the backyard of my parents' residence, that the restraint had been executed by my brother Derek using police-issued handcuffs, that the condition for my release was the signing of a document transferring assets, and that this constituted, among other charges, extortion through restriction of liberty, carrying a potential prison sentence of 4 to 10 years. Derek told me to shut up. I kept going. I said documents signed under duress carry absolutely zero legal validity. That everyone present who remained on the property with knowledge of what was occurring and took no action could be charged as accessories. That the law makes no distinction between the person committing the crime and the person facilitating it with their conscious presence. I saw Jason set his cup down. Derek got right in my face and told me, inches away, that I was an arrogant snob who always thought she was better than everyone else, that our grandmother was a senile old lady I had exploited, that he was doing what any cop would do, protecting a family from fraud. I asked him, looking dead into his eyes, if this was what he called protection. He raised his hand. Not to hit me, at least not right then. It was a threatening gesture, that calculated move by someone trying to make the other person flinch. For years, I would have flinched. For years, that move worked. I kept my eyes locked on his. I didn't blink. I didn't move a muscle. Derek's hand hung in the air for 2 seconds. 3. Then he lowered his arm and took 2 steps back, and I saw, in that slight retreat, that something had shifted. He recognized, on a primal level, that I was no longer the easy target I used to be. Jason stepped toward me as Derek turned his back. He crouched down next to me, his voice barely a whisper, and asked if I had managed to call someone. I confirmed with a look. I asked if he could hold his nerve for the next few minutes. He closed his eyes for a second, opened them, said yes. In that suffocating yard thick with barbecue smoke, family tension, and decades of lies, Jason was the only adult who had made the right decision. And I needed him to hold on to that decision for just a few more minutes. Because just outside that yard, on the quiet street of the suburban neighborhood, an unmarked black SUV had just turned the corner. I heard it before I saw it. The low hum of a heavy engine slowing down, the subtle crunch of tires on warm asphalt. Nothing that would catch the attention of anyone not expecting it. But I was expecting it. Derek was facing away from the front of the house when the doorbell rang. My dad went to answer it, assuming it was a neighbor or a late relative. He opened the door and stood in dead silence for a second, that specific silence when the brain sees something it can't immediately process. Then he stepped out of the way. 4 federal agents walked through the front door in formation. 2 more came down the side alley into the backyard, which was unlocked. They didn't run, they didn't yell, they didn't draw weapons, but there was a physical presence in their movement that made any other action impossible. Tactical vests, federal badges clearly visible, the posture of people who do this with real training and real authority. The backyard went absolutely dead silent. Derek spun around when he heard the footsteps in the side alley. It took him less than a second to identify what he was looking at, less than a second, but it was enough for the cop logic inside him to calculate, correctly, that there was nothing he could do. That this was a federal team, that the jurisdiction was out of his hands, that the county detective badge on his belt was, in this specific context, completely irrelevant. I saw the exact moment it hit him. I saw it in his shoulders first, that specific deflation when the body absorbs a defeat before the mind finishes processing it. The lead agent identified himself. Read him his Miranda rights. Used precise terms, a level voice, no drama. It wasn't a movie scene, it was federal protocol executed by professionals. Derek didn't resist. He dropped the spare set of cuffs he was holding at his belt, placed his hands on his head, and was handcuffed. The process took less than 40 seconds. My mom appeared at the sliding glass door leading to the yard and just stared. She was holding a dish towel. She didn't drop it. She just stood there, looking at Derek handcuffed in his own parents' yard, with a look I'd never seen on her face, not despair, not tears, not anger. Emptiness. Like the script she'd followed her whole life had turned to a page that didn't exist. A female federal agent approached me with a professional but highly attentive expression. She examined my wrists, assessed the cuffs, asked if I was injured. She noted the marks of excessive pressure on my left wrist and said I would need medical attention. The agent used a specialized tool to snap the chain of the handcuffs without needing the key, which Derek had stuffed in his pocket and no one had asked him for. When the metal came off my wrists, the sensation was intensely physical and something else entirely. A lightness that wasn't just in my arms. I stood up. My dad was still standing near the yard gate. He had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The loud patriarch, the man who for decades divided the world into those who deserved respect and those who didn't, and I had never been on the right side of that divide, was standing with his arms hanging limp at his sides, looking at his handcuffed son like someone sifting through a disaster scene trying to find something to salvage. There was nothing to salvage. Megan finally looked at me. She didn't say a word. But there was something in her face, not regret, not exactly, but a belated, painful realization that she had been on the wrong side of this. Jason stood in the corner of the yard with his arms crossed, completely quiet. Later, when one of the agents approached him for a statement, he recounted everything he had seen with a clarity and precision that proved he had been paying attention to every single detail from the start. I went to the bathroom again, this time on my own terms, with no one marching me there. I turned on the cold water and ran my wrists under the faucet. The stinging was immediate, then slowly faded. I stood like that for a few minutes, staring at the red grooves around my joints. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about the letter she had left, officially notarized, explaining every choice with a serene clarity that only comes from someone who lived a long time, observed a lot, and drew her own conclusions. She hadn't been naive. She hadn't been manipulated. She had made a conscious choice based on decades of observing her own family. And she had chosen me. Not because I was perfect, or because I had sacrificed myself, or because I was entitled to some moral reward. But because, when she needed someone, I was there. Simple as that. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands, walked back out to the yard. The next few hours were the hardest part, not because of the danger, which had passed, but because of the specific nature of what happens after a situation like this ends. Danger has a strange clarity to it. What comes after is just messy devastation. Derek was taken into custody. My dad was brought in for questioning, not arrested on the spot, but escorted down to the station. My mom stayed in the yard with one agent while another took her statement. She answered in that tone I knew by heart, the tone of someone utterly convinced she is the victim of everything, that things just happened to her, never because of her. Megan cried a lot. She kept repeating that she didn't know, she never imagined it would go that far, she thought it was just going to be a conversation. Jason stood next to her but didn't say anything to confirm or contradict her. He let her talk. Later, when an agent asked him directly what he had witnessed, he described the facts without embellishment and without omission. I gave my own statement in a separate room. I was precise, chronological, and avoided any dramatization. I described every moment from my arrival until the emergency protocol was triggered. I quoted every relevant phrase I had heard. I confirmed the identity of everyone present and the role each had played. While I was talking, in the back of my mind, a parallel thought was running that I couldn't completely shut off, that this family had been the first place I ever learned I needed to be strong. Not because they taught me how to be strong, but because the alternative was being destroyed, and I had chosen, early on, not to be destroyed. My grandmother had seen that, and she did what she could to make sure I had what I needed to keep going. The investigation that followed uncovered things I didn't know, or only knew pieces of, without seeing the whole picture. Derek had racked up significant debts through private off-the-books deals I was unaware of. He had promised informal creditors he'd have his financial situation resolved soon. He had convinced my parents the will was a fraud, or maybe my parents needed to be convinced because they wanted to be, because the alternative was accepting that my grandmother had made a conscious decision to cut them out. The document they wanted me to sign had been drafted by Derek. No lawyer had ever touched that paper. It was legally void in so many different ways I couldn't even list them all off the top of my head without laughing, and it wasn't a humorous laugh. The badge and the handcuffs he used were state property. That made the crime much worse, not better. It meant he had abused state equipment for private gain, which effectively doubled the severity of almost every possible charge. Jason sought me out before I left. We stood on the sidewalk in front of my parents' house, the afternoon air starting to chill, the smell of burgers still hanging around in a way that felt obscene considering everything that had just happened. He told me he was sorry. Not as an excuse, as a declaration from someone staring at something broken beyond repair and acknowledging it clearly. I told him I knew he hadn't been part of the plan. That his presence as a witness had been crucial. That I wasn't angry with him. There was something I needed to ask, so I did. Why hadn't he left earlier? There had been a moment, before I was handcuffed, where he could have easily made an excuse and walked away. He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said that when he realized what was going down, he froze. That after the cuffs went on, he went from paralyzed to something else. He didn't know exactly what to call it, but he said it was the feeling that a line was being crossed right in front of him, and if he walked away then, he'd be letting that line be crossed without a witness. I understood that. It was a small decision, but it wasn't a small decision. I drove back to my house that night in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't turn on my phone. I just let the silence of the city surround me, the streetlights, the other cars, the mechanical rhythm of traffic. When I got home, I sat in my living room armchair without turning on a single light. I stayed like that for an amount of time I can't accurately measure. I wasn't processing, I was just being. Existing in the silence after a day that had permanently altered so many things. Then I turned on the lamp, walked into the kitchen, made some tea, and called my personal attorney to map out the next steps. The months that followed were slow in the highly specific way legal proceedings are slow: piles of documents, dates, hearings scheduled and continued, depositions, cross-examinations, expert reviews, and briefs. I knew this rhythm from the inside, had operated within it for years, but living it as an involved party is a completely different experience. Derek was indicted for unlawful restraint, abuse of authority, extortion, and misuse of state-issued police equipment. He was suspended immediately after the incident. Internal Affairs uncovered other irregularities I knew nothing about, previous incidents that had been buried or swept under the rug. That day in the backyard had pulled a thread that had been fraying for much longer than I ever realized. My dad was indicted as an accessory to extortion and for failure to provide assistance. The subsequent medical exam confirmed the bruising on my wrists constituted bodily injury, and he had been present and conscious while it happened. His case moved slower, but it moved forward. My mom took a plea deal. She cooperated with investigators in exchange for a lighter sentence. She never called me once during that entire period. Never sent a text. I heard, through the grapevine, that she had moved out of state to live with her sister. I didn't try to contact her. Megan reached out once, via text. She said she was sorry, that she had been terrified of crossing Derek, that she knew she hadn't done the right thing but just didn't have the courage. She didn't ask for my forgiveness, at least she had that much clarity. She only asked me to know that she hadn't planned any of it with them. I replied once, briefly. I told her I understood she had been scared. That she hadn't planned it. And that, even so, there comes a point where watching a crime happen to someone and staying silent is a choice, and she had made that choice. I told her I didn't hate her, but I needed distance. There was no second text. Jason mailed me a book, no note, just the book. It was a title about recovering from relational trauma. I stared at the package for a while, thinking it was a strange but incredibly honest gesture. There was nothing to say, so he had sent something without having to say a word. I put it on my bookshelf. The estate was formally transferred to my account 4 months after the incident, once the document reviews were complete and my grandmother's will was validated. There were no successful legal challenges. The document had been drafted with the meticulous technical care of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had anticipated the likelihood of a dispute. My grandmother had consulted an estate planning attorney 2 years before she died. She had undergone a cognitive capacity evaluation with a geriatric specialist, and the report was filed away. She had signed the will in front of 2 independent witnesses with no ties to the family. She had left the explanatory letter fully notarized. She had prepared. She knew what was coming. I remember the day I went to the bank to finalize the transfer. I sat in a conference room with a branch manager and 2 assistants and signed a mountain of paperwork. The process took a little over an hour. When I finished, I walked out through the glass doors and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. $4.2 million. A lifetime of work from a woman who came to this country with nothing, who built it up over decades, who saved in silence, and who chose where to leave it with a clarity I only fully grasped later. I didn't feel euphoria. I didn't feel the lightness people sometimes imagine money brings. I felt something closer to responsibility, a clean responsibility, completely free of guilt, but very real. I used a portion of that money in a way my grandmother would have approved of. I hired a team of lawyers to establish a legal aid foundation for vulnerable women. It wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was continuing the work through a different avenue. The exact same thing I had done as a public defender, only now with real structure and real resources to reach places the state couldn't. In the following months, while my brother's criminal case dragged on, I kept working. I was back on the bench the week after the incident. I took 2 days off to let my wrists heal and get the required medical documentation sorted. On the 3rd day, I was back. My colleagues knew what had happened. It was impossible for them not to, given the nature of the emergency dispatch and the indictments that followed. No one brought it up directly with me. But there was a different kind of respect in the hallways. Not pity, acknowledgement. Derek's trial took place 7 months later. I didn't attend as a judge, I attended as a victim and a witness. I sat on the prosecution's side, on a hard wooden bench, hands folded in my lap, and watched the proceedings unfold with the calm of someone who has spent her entire life inside rooms just like that. Derek hired a defense attorney who tried to spin a narrative of a poorly managed family dispute, an overprotective brother concerned about the integrity of a will, impulsive actions born of legitimate emotion. Technically speaking, it was a reasonable defense strategy. The problem was the video. At one point during that afternoon cookout, before the agents arrived, Megan had recorded a clip on her phone, not intentionally as evidence, but because she had reflexively raised her phone when things got tense, and let it record for a few minutes before putting it down. She had handed that video over to investigators the very next day, entirely on her own, without anyone asking her to. In that video, the audio was crystal clear. You could hear my dad explicitly stating I would be let out of the handcuffs once I signed the document. You could see the cuffs on my wrists. You could hear Derek declaring he had the authority to detain whoever he wanted in the backyard of that house. The defense attorney didn't have much to work with after that video played. I watched the trial with a different kind of attention than when I'm sitting behind the bench. Up there, you process facts, evaluate evidence, build legal reasoning. Down here, you just feel. You feel the weight of every testimony, the clinical coldness of forensic reports translating physical pain into legal jargon, the numbers of the penal codes describing in abstract terms what had happened concretely in your own family's backyard. When the judge read the verdict, I stayed completely still. Derek was found guilty. His sentence included the permanent loss of his badge, financial restitution, and prison time, with the possibility of parole after serving an initial mandatory stretch. I won't list the exact numbers because they aren't the point. The point is there was a verdict. There were consequences. The law worked. I walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone in the family. There wasn't a single member of my immediate family present anyway. My mom was out of state, my dad was awaiting his own trial, and Megan had chosen not to show up. There were a few distant cousins in the back of the gallery, but I didn't meet their eyes. I walked to the parking garage, got in my car, and sat there for a few minutes with my hands on the steering wheel. I thought about my grandmother again. I thought about her backyard, so different from my parents' yard, smaller, much simpler, with a lemon tree in the corner and a wooden rocking chair she used in the afternoons. I thought about the afternoons I spent there as a teenager, escaping the noise of my parents' house. She didn't say much during those visits. She'd make tea, put something on the table to eat, and sit in her rocking chair while I either sat quietly, talked, or sometimes just cried without being able to explain why. She never told me things were going to get better. She never offered that kind of generic comfort that ultimately means nothing. She just stayed there, present, and sometimes she'd say, "You have more than you think." I was 35 years old and still learning what she meant by that. I started the car, pulled out of the garage, drove home. That night, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened the notebook I used to write in back when I was a law student, back when I needed to organize my thoughts somehow before I could fall asleep. I wrote for almost an hour. It wasn't about the trial, it wasn't about the inheritance, it wasn't about Derek or my parents. I wrote about my grandmother. About the lemon tree and the rocking chair. About the tea. About the kind of silence she knew how to create that wasn't abandonment, it was presence. I wrote that I finally understood why she chose me. Not because I was the most deserving in some abstract, moral sense of the word, but because I was the only one who had chosen to be there. And she had done the exact same for me. I closed the notebook, went to sleep. The next morning I woke up early, like always. Made coffee, read the news for a few minutes, got ready. I pulled my judicial robe from the closet and draped it over my shoulders. As I adjusted the collar, I caught a glimpse of my wrists in the mirror. The marks had faded completely, the skin had healed, the redness was gone. There was just a very faint, paper-thin scar on my left wrist, right where the cuff had dug in the hardest. It was almost invisible. But I knew it was there. It didn't bother me. It was just a record. Proof that it had happened, that I had walked through the fire, and that I had made it to the other side. I left the house. Went up to my chambers at the courthouse. Opened the day's docket, which was packed. It was time to get to work. Now, if you like this story, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments, which part made your jaw drop. Oh, and don't forget to become a member for access to exclusive videos I don't post here. See you there.